The candle went out at exactly the wrong moment. Tobias Wren had been warned about this. His instructor at the Ardeenmore Academy of Arcane Studies, a lean, permanently exhausted woman named Magistra Holt, who had been teaching first-year students for longer than most of them had been alive, had said it plainly on the first day of class. A mage who cannot maintain concentration under pressure is a mage who is decorative at best and catastrophically dangerous at worst. Tobias had written this down. He had reviewed it twice. He had believed himself, with the confidence particular to 18-year-olds who have shown exceptional theoretical aptitude and no practical experience whatsoever, to understand what it meant. The candle went out, and the darkness closed in, and Tobias understood for the first time that he had not understood it at all. He was standing in the lower archive of Ardeenmore's East Tower, a place he was absolutely not supposed to be at 3 hours past midnight, with a relight candle in one hand, a borrowed translation lexicon under his arm, and a growing awareness that the sound he had just heard from behind the far shelving stack was not, as he had briefly hoped, a cat. Ardeenmore kept no cats. The academy occupied a converted fortress on the northern edge of the city of Crestfall, a university town built on the confluence of 2 rivers and a significant deposit of naturally occurring magical resonance that had been making compasses unreliable in the surrounding area for approximately 400 years. The East Tower was the oldest part of the complex, predating the Academy's founding by at least 2 centuries, and the Lower Archive was its least visited room, a long, low-ceilinged space lined floor-to-ceiling with shelving that held the collection's oldest and least legible materials, the ones that hadn't been properly cataloged yet and probably wouldn't be during Tobias's lifetime. It smelled of old vellum, dried wax, and the particular mustiness of knowledge that had been waiting patiently for someone to need it. He had come here because of a name. 3 days ago, during a routine translation exercise in his intermediate script class, a class he was taking a year early, which was the kind of thing that earned him respectful nods from instructors, and somewhat less respectful glances from his peers, he had encountered a reference he couldn't account for. It appeared in the marginalia of a 14th century text on elemental theory, a single phrase in a regional dialect of Old Caldric, annotated by some long-ago reader in cramped, urgent handwriting. The phrase translated roughly as, "The hollow bell does not ring for the living." He had asked Magistra Holt about it. She had looked at the page, said, "Interesting notation," and moved on with the lesson in the brisk manner of a person who had decided not to pursue something. This was, in Tobias's experience, the clearest possible signal that something was worth pursuing. The hollow bell. He had found it in the archive's index under 3 separate headings, all of which redirected him to materials stored in the Lower East Archive, none of which he had permission to access. He had spent 2 days constructing an argument for why he should be given access, determined that the argument was solid, but that the approval process would take approximately 3 weeks, and then spent the next hour deciding that 3 weeks was too long. Hence the archive, the borrowed lexicon, and the 3 hours past midnight. He held up the candle and waited for his pulse to slow. The sound came again. A dry, papery sliding, like a large book being drawn slowly across a wooden shelf. From 2 shelves down and perhaps 20 feet further into the dark. Tobias's magical training was, at this point in his academic career, primarily theoretical. He knew the verbal and somatic components of approximately 40 spells. He had successfully cast 11 of them to varying degrees of accuracy. He was confident in his prestidigitation, solid on his mending cantrip, and had achieved what Magistra Holt had described as, technically, competent but aggressively cautious results with his first-level spells. His light cantrip was reliable. His detect magic, which he had practiced more than anything else because it required sustained concentration, and he was determined to address his concentration problem at its root, was becoming consistent. He cast light now, not on the candle, which he kept burning for the warmth of it, but on the small, smooth stone he kept in his left pocket precisely for this purpose, a trick his older sister, Pitra, had taught him before he'd left, for Ardeenmore. The stone began to glow with a clean, steady white light, and he held it up and walked toward the sound. The thing he found was not what he expected. Crouched between 2 shelving stacks, holding a water-damaged folio with the specific careful grip of someone who is trying very hard not to damage something further, was a boy of perhaps 12 or 13. He was thin in the way of children who had missed too many meals, dressed in clothes that had been good quality once and were honest about the time that had passed since, and he was looking up at Tobias with dark eyes that held equal measures of defiance and terror, arranged in the precise proportions of someone who has been caught and is calculating whether flight is still an option. Tobias stared at him. The boy stared back. "The folio you're holding," Tobias said finally, keeping his voice low because sound carried oddly in the archive, "is almost certainly not what you came here for." The boy's jaw tightened. He did not put the folio down, and he did not run. "Because the hollow bell materials are on the upper shelves," Tobias continued, watching the boy's face. "Left side. 4 shelves up from the floor." The flash of recognition in the boy's eyes was unmistakable, and it told Tobias something important. Whatever this child was doing in the restricted archive of the Ardeenmoor Academy at 3 in the morning, he was not here by accident. His name was Emmerich, and he had a story, and like most honest stories, it was more complicated than it first appeared. He told it reluctantly and in pieces, the way people tell things they've been keeping to themselves for long enough that the telling has become strange, each part coming out with a kind of cautious force, as though he wasn't certain the words would survive contact with air. Tobias listened, sitting cross-legged on the archive floor with his back against a shelving unit, the glowing stone between them casting everything in that clean, impersonal light. He had learned early in his life that the fastest way to make someone stop talking was to ask too many questions. Emmerich was from Howick, a small fishing town 2 days east of Crestfall on the river delta. He was not, as far as Tobias could determine, a student of anything formal, but he had a quality of applied intelligence that was immediately recognizable to Tobias, because it was the same quality he saw in his own mirror. The kind that worked best in the absence of instruction, that learned primarily by doing things it probably shouldn't, and then thinking very hard about what had happened. 3 weeks ago, Emmerich said, something had changed in Howick, not dramatically. Not all at once. It had begun as what the town's adults had decided to call a weather phenomenon, a sound heard only at night that came from somewhere over the river and moved through the town like a slow tide, low enough to feel in the chest rather than hear with the ears. It came every night, a few hours before dawn, and it lasted perhaps 20 minutes before fading. Some people said they dreamed differently on nights they heard it. Some people stopped sleeping well. A few of the fishing boats came back late, the crews disoriented and unable to account precisely for their time out on the water. The town's elder, a practical woman named Graff, who had been managing Howick's affairs for 20 years through floods and hard winters and one genuinely inconvenient river troll situation, had sent for a specialist from the nearest city. The specialist, a licensed arcanist properly certified, who charged accordingly, had spent 2 days in Howick, declared the sound to be a natural phenomenon related to the river delta's acoustic properties, collected his fee, and returned to the city. The sound continued. Emmerich had begun researching it himself because Emmerich, as far as Tobias could tell, was constitutionally incapable of leaving a problem alone. He had found a reference in a very old almanac that his grandmother kept in the back of her storage shed, a copy of the Crestfall River Delta Historical Record, 3rd edition, published approximately 90 years ago, to an event called the Hollow Bell. The almanac described it in one paragraph tersely as an acoustic magical phenomena of uncertain origin, associated with the river confluences north of Howick, documented twice in living memory at the time of this writing, resolved on both occasions by the intervention of an Ardeenmoor certified practitioner working with local cooperation. Both previous occurrences, the almanac noted, had been preceded by a period of disorientation among the local population lasting 2 to 3 weeks. Emmerich had been in Howick for 3 weeks already. So he had done what seemed to him like the most logical thing. He had walked 2 days to Crestfall, found the academy, and decided to access the relevant archive himself, rather than wait for adult institutions to move at their preferred pace. The certified arcanist your elder hired got it wrong, Tobias said. Or he didn't care about getting it right, Emmerich said, with the particular flat precision of a child who has watched adults fail at things and has concluded that authority and competence are different properties. Tobias thought about this. It was not a comfortable thought. The Hollow Bell, he said. What do you know about it, actually? Beyond the almanac entry? Emmerich reached into his jacket and produced a folded piece of paper covered in very small, dense handwriting. Tobias took it and held it near the glowing stone. It was a compilation of references, dates, source titles, brief notations organized with a thoroughness that made Tobias feel Not for the first time that evening that this 12-year-old was showing him something about the practice of research that his first year at Ardeenmore had not. The notes indicated that the hollow bell had been documented 7 times in the recorded history of the Crestfall River Delta, always in the same general area north of Hawick, always between the autumn equinox and midwinter, always lasting between 3 and 6 weeks, before either resolving naturally or being addressed by a practitioner. The resolution methods varied. In 3 cases, the records mentioned the use of a counter-resonance working without further detail. In 1 case, the record simply noted source located and removed. In 2 cases, the records were incomplete. And the 7th case? Tobias asked, looking up. Emrich's expression shifted in a way that Tobias couldn't quite categorize. "That's what I came here to find," he said. The almanac says the 7th occurrence was documented in a restricted Ardeenmore field report. Reference number 4471E, filed approximately 30 years ago. It was never resolved. The archive was very quiet. Tobias stood up, took the glowing stone, and began looking for field report 4471E. He found it 40 minutes later on the upper left shelves where the hollow bell materials were indexed, in a thin folder of water-damaged pages that had clearly been stored here and not retrieved since they'd arrived. He read it standing up, holding the stone close to the faded ink, while Emrich sat below him on the shelving ladder and waited. The report was filed by a practitioner named Aldrich Voss, 31 years ago. It described an investigation of a hollow bell occurrence near Hawick, 5 weeks of field observation, 3 attempted counter-resonance workings, all unsuccessful. The final entry, which was dated and signed and then had a line struck through it and rewritten, read, "Source identified as structural, not a summoned phenomenon. Recommend long-term monitoring. Will return in the spring." Below that, in different ink and a different hand, someone had written 2 words. He didn't. Tobias looked at that for a long time. Then he climbed down the shelving ladder, sat back down on the archive floor, and looked at Emrich, who had read his face accurately and was looking back with the specific expression of a person who already knows the answer to the question that is about to be asked. "How long has your town been hearing the sound?" 22 days, Emrich said. Tobias calculated. 3 to 6 weeks for a natural resolution or intervention. 22 days already elapsed. Structural source per the last field report, meaning this wasn't something summoned that could be dismissed. It was something that had grown in the place, that had roots. "I need to tell someone about this," he said. "I know," Emrich said. "That's why I let you find me." The next 3 days were a lesson in the distance between knowing something theoretically and discovering what it costs in practice. Tobias had told Magistra Holt. He had told her everything: the archive visit, Emrich, the field report, the timeline. He had laid it out in the clear, organized fashion that she had taught him to use for theoretical presentations. And he had watched her face while he did it, and what he saw there was not what he expected. He expected skepticism. He expected the measured, critical engagement she brought to student work, the kind that found the weaknesses in an argument before the argument could find them itself. What he saw instead was recognition. And behind the recognition, something that took him a moment to identify correctly. She had known about this. Not all of it. Not Emrich, not the current occurrence. But Aldrich Voss. Tobias saw the name land on her face like a stone dropped into still water, sending rings outward that she controlled quickly, professionally, and not quite quickly enough. "Voss was a student of mine," she said, after a pause that was slightly too long. "A long time ago. His report says the source is structural," Tobias said carefully. "That means it's still there." "Yes," she said. "It does. And if someone went back now, with the right preparation, Tobias." Her voice had the particular quality she used when she was about to say something she had decided in advance to mean. "You are a first-year student who has successfully cast 11 spells and broke into a restricted archive last night. I want to be precise with you. That does not qualify you to address a structural resonance phenomenon that defeated a practitioner with 15 years of field experience." "I know," he said. "I'm not saying I should go alone." She looked at him for a moment. "No," she said. "You're not, are you?" The next day, she accompanied him to the Department of Field Studies and formally requested an emergency assessment of the Hawick situation under the Academy's Civic Response Charter, which required the Academy to provide a certified response to active magical phenomena affecting civilian populations within a 2-day radius of Crestfall. The department head, an enormous and chronically cheerful man named Proctor Adwell, who had the look of someone who had gone on a very great number of field expeditions and thoroughly enjoyed all of them, read the file in approximately 4 minutes, and said, "Oh, the hollow bell again. I had wondered when that was coming back." He assigned a field team within the hour. Magistra Holt as supervising practitioner. Tobias as consulting researcher, under field student protocols that made very clear he was to observe and assist and not under any circumstances attempt anything independently. Emmerich, who had refused to wait in Crestfall with a calm certainty that made arguing with him feel pointless, as local guide. They reached Hawick on the second day of travel, arriving just as the evening light went amber over the river delta. Tobias heard the sound for the first time that night. He had been prepared for it, intellectually, and preparation helped with some things. It did not help with the sound itself. It came as Emmerich had described, low, felt more than heard, moving through the walls of the borrowed room in the fisherman's house where they were, staying and settling in the chest with the weight of something that didn't belong there. It was not unpleasant, precisely. That was the disturbing part. There was a quality to it that he might have called beautiful in different circumstances, in the way that certain very old things had a beauty that was inseparable from their capacity to cause harm. He cast Detect Magic. The wave of arcane perception that expanded from him with the spell was immediately, uncomfortably overwhelmed. Detect Magic worked by allowing the caster to sense the presence and school of magical emanations within 30 feet. What Tobias sensed now was not within 30 feet. It was everywhere, diffused through the delta soil and the river water and the air above the town with the thoroughness of something that had been building for 30 years and had run out of patience. The school of magic was unmistakably transmutation, not the clean, purposive transmutation of a practitioner's deliberate working, but the slow, geological transmutation of a natural resonance site that had been disturbed and had been trying, ever since, to correct itself. He lay awake for a long time after the sound faded, thinking. The structural source Voss had identified. The reason his 3 counter-resonance workings had failed. The solution was in the report. It had to be in the negative space of what Voss had tried and not done. Counter-resonance worked on summoned phenomena because it opposed them directly. Against a structural source, opposing it directly would be like trying to stop a river by standing in front of it. The river, the delta confluence, the point where 2 rivers met and the magical resonance in the bedrock was highest. He was out of bed and writing notes before he fully knew he'd made a decision. Emmerich was awake. He was sitting at the small table near the window in the shared room, apparently having decided at some point that sleeping during the hollow bell was not something he was going to do, and he watched Tobias write with an expression that said, quite clearly, that he had been waiting for this. "Tell me about the confluence," Tobias said. "The point where the rivers meet. Has anyone built anything there in the last 35 years? Emmerich thought for a moment. "They rerouted the North Channel," he said. "About 30 years ago, to extend the navigable stretch. They moved the confluence point about half a mile east." Tobias stopped writing. "They moved it," he said. "Yes, they moved the natural confluence of 2 rivers," he said, "in a region sitting on a resonance deposit that has been documented since the founding of Crestfall. No one thought that was a problem," Emmerich said, with the flat calm of someone delivering a fact that is itself an accusation. Tobias set down his pen. The shape of the problem had just become entirely clear. The resonance in the bedrock was anchored to the natural confluence point, the original one, half a mile west of where the rivers currently met. When the channel was rerouted, the anchoring point and the active confluence had been separated. The resonance had been trying to bridge that gap ever since. The hollow bell was not a phenomenon. It was a symptom. It was a system in distress, sending out the equivalent of a signal or a request. And then, with the peculiar precision of a thought arriving slightly too late to prevent anything, Tobias realized something else. The reason Voss's counter-resonance workings had failed was the same reason any attempt to suppress or oppose the sound would fail. You couldn't counter a structural need. You could only meet it. He looked at Emmerich. "I need to talk to Magister Holt." He crossed the hall and knocked. There was a pause, and then the door opened, and Holt looked at him with the expression of someone who had not been asleep either, and had been waiting to see how long it would take him to get there. "The channel rerouting," she said, before he could speak. "You knew," he said. "I suspected," she said, "for about the last 10 years. Voss identified the source as structural but didn't understand why it was structural. I didn't have proof, and I didn't have a solution. She stepped back from the door. Come in. Tell me what you've worked out. They stood at the original confluence point at the hour before dawn, which was when the hollow bell would come. The site was unremarkable in the way that significant places often were, a shallow bank where the river made a particular bend, the ground marshy at the edges, old willow trees trailing their fingers in the current. Nothing marked it as special. 30 years of the river flowing half a mile away had left it quieter than it should be. Water still moved through it in slow, seasonal floods, but the full living pressure of the confluence was gone, and the absence had its own quality, a held-breath stillness that Tobias felt as he stepped onto the bank and cast Detect Magic for the 7th time that day. The resonance here was immense. Not overwhelming in the way it had been diffused through the town, concentrated, deep, specific. It pulsed with a slow rhythm, just below the threshold of perception, the way a sleeping person breathes. He had been right. This was the anchor. Magistra Holt stood beside him, her own detection active, her face doing the thing it did when she was doing complicated mathematics in her head and had decided not to share the process until she had an answer. Enric stood 5 feet behind them at the exact position he had maintained all morning, close enough to witness everything, far enough to make clear he understood the boundary between observation and interference. The principle is harmonic alignment, Tobias said for the 3rd time, because saying it again was how he made sure he still believed it. If the resonance is trying to bridge the gap to the current confluence, we don't suppress it. We give it what it's looking for. We use the working to create a harmonic link between this point and the current one, essentially convincing the resonance that the 2 points are the same point. A sustained transmutation working, Holt said. Anchored at both ends. Maintained long enough for the resonance to stabilize. Yes. That's graduate-level work, Tobias. I know. The construction is precise. The harmonic calibration alone. I've been doing the calculations since 2 this morning. He held up the pages. She took them, she read them. He watched her read them and he did not say anything and he did not look away from her face. She handed the pages back. There are 2 errors in the 4th sequence, she said. They'll cancel each other out if you build the structure in this order. She indicated the page, rather than this one. He looked. She was right. He corrected the sequence. You lead the construction, she said. I'll hold the anchor. If at any point the calibration drifts more than a quarter tone, you stop and I rebuild from the primary node. Understood? She understood, he said. Emmerich, she said, without turning. I'll be here, Emmerich said. I won't touch anything. She almost smiled. It was very brief. The working took 47 minutes to construct. Tobias had never attempted anything close to this in practice. Theoretically, he understood the architecture of a harmonic alignment working, the layering of transmutation energies, the careful calibration that prevented one resonant frequency from overwhelming another, the structural nodes that held the working stable over time. He had drawn diagrams of workings like this in his theoretical classes. He had described them in examinations and received high marks and felt, privately, that he understood them well. He had not understood them at all, it turned out, until the moment he began constructing one under field conditions. In pre-dawn darkness, with a convergence of natural resonance pressing against his concentration from below and the sound of the river, and the specific quality of Magistra Holt's absolute focused silence beside him, which communicated more than any words could have about how precisely she was paying attention and how precisely she expected this to be done. He made mistakes. He caught them. There was a moment in the 3rd sequence when the calibration slipped and he felt the working begin to collapse and his mind went absolutely white and still in the way it went when something was going very wrong. And then Holt's anchor settled against the primary node with the calm certainty of someone who has been exactly here before and knows that steadiness is a choice. And he found the calibration again and rebuilt. Enric on the bank made no sound at all. He stood very still with his hands folded and his dark eyes intent on the space above the water where the working was taking visible shape as the resonances met and began to find each other. A faint shimmer, more perceived. Then seen like looking at heat over summer stone, but colder and deeper and far more precise. The moment the harmonic link completed, Tobias felt it as a physical thing. A settling deep in the ground beneath his feet. the resolution of a pressure that had been building for 30 years as the resonance in the bedrock recognized what it had been looking for and stopped reaching. The shimmer above the water steadied and became still. The sky to the east was beginning to gray. The hollow bell did not come that dawn. Tobias sat down on the muddy bank with his feet in the water and his hands in his lap, and he was more tired than he had ever been in his life, and the working was stable and complete, and thrumming in the bedrock below him with the patient reliability of something that intended to remain indefinitely. And he thought about Aldrich Voss and the spring he hadn't come back for, and about Magistra Holt, who had suspected for 10 years and hadn't had the proof, and about a 12-year-old boy who had walked 2 days on his own because he'd found a reference in a very old almanac and couldn't leave it alone. He looked at Emmerich, who was sitting beside him on the bank. He hadn't heard him sit down. "It's done," Tobias said. Emmerich looked at the river. "It's different now," he said after a moment. "The sound it makes." Tobias listened. He was right. The river moved through the bend with a new quality, fuller, more complete, as though something it had been missing had been returned to it. "You should come back to Ardeenmoor with us," Tobias said. "Formally." "The Academy has a scholarship program for exceptional students without institutional backgrounds." "I can write the referral." Emmerich looked at him with those careful, dark eyes. "You've been a student for 1 year," he said. 14 months, Tobias said. "And yes. But I've met the selection committee's standard for referral candidates. I read the charter." He paused. "Also, I owe you. You let me find you in that archive on purpose because you needed someone to help you bring this to the right people. And it worked, and you should have the resources to do that kind of thing without breaking into restricted collections in the middle of the night." Emmerich considered this for a long time. "I'll think about it," he said, which was the most decisive answer Tobias had ever heard from someone who had been trying to sound non-committal. Holt stood a few feet away on the bank, looking at the working, stable shimmer, and Tobias thought she was probably not going to say anything about the conversation she'd just heard, which was how he knew she had heard it and agreed with it. The river ran on. The sky kept graying toward dawn. Tobias Wren, first-year student, exceptionally cautious caster of 11 spells, sat on a muddy bank in the delta and felt the change in the ground beneath him and thought about the distance between knowing something and doing it, and how the gap between those two things was exactly as wide as one very long night and exactly as crossable. The referral went through in the spring. Emmerich Vale. He had a family name, it turned out, though he hadn't volunteered it until the paperwork required it, arrived at Ardeenmoor with a small pack, a battered almanac, and 12 handwritten notebooks of independent research. That made the admissions committee's assessment process take considerably longer than standard. Proctor Adwell reviewed the notebooks personally and came out of his office afterward with the specific expression of someone who has just encountered a problem they are extremely pleased to have. He was placed in a combined theoretical and practical track that did not precisely exist in the Academy's standard curriculum, which required the creation of a new administrative category and 3 separate committee meetings, and the permanent addition of a footnote to the enrollment charter. No one involved found this excessive. Emmerich himself had opinions about the curriculum that he expressed in writing with footnotes before the first month was out. Magistra Holt filed the full field report for the Halwick working under Tobias's name, as primary architect, with herself as supervising practitioner. This was the subject of some comment in the department, as field reports of that class were not typically filed under first-year students. She declined to discuss the comment. The report was filed. The thing had been done by the person who had done it, and Holt had a long-standing policy against inaccurate documentation. In Halwick, the nights were quiet. Elder Grath sent a letter to the Academy expressing the town's gratitude in the specific MEACURED language of a practical person who found gratitude slightly uncomfortable to express and was doing it anyway because it was appropriate. The letter mentioned, in its second paragraph, that the navigation channel was being reviewed for possible rerouting, and that the town's engineering committee had requested access to any relevant survey documentation about the area's geological and magical properties before proceeding with any modifications. Tobias read that paragraph 3 times and felt something he would eventually identify, in retrospect, as the first stirring of a professional vocation. He finished his first year with marks that his instructors described carefully as strong in theoretical grounding and developing rapidly in applied judgment, which was the Academy's precise way of noting that a student had demonstrated competence exceeding their experience and ought to be watched. He did not break into any more restricted archives, or not without authorization, which he applied for through proper channels and received in timely fashion twice in the subsequent semester. He did, on a cold evening in late autumn, go back to the Hollow Bell site, alone this time, just to look. He stood on the bank above the old confluence point and listened to the river, which moved with that new fullness he had noticed at dawn that day in the delta, and he cast detect magic out of habit, and because he wanted to feel it again. The deep, slow pulse of the bedrock resonance, stable and settled and no longer reaching, doing what it had always been designed by simple geological time to do, which was to be the ground beneath someone's feet. He stood there for a while. The evening light went gold, and then amber, and then the blue of early dark, and the first stars appeared and the river ran. He had been just a novice mage until that night. He had not stopped being a novice. That was not the kind of thing one night resolved, and he was honest enough to know it. But there was a line, he understood now, between the theoretical self and the practiced one, and crossing it was not about the spell you cast or the working you completed. It was about the moment you looked at a problem that was genuinely too large for you and chose to stay with it anyway, and found, standing in that gap between what you knew and what was required, that you were capable of more than the knowledge you had so far accumulated. The river was cold and the air smelled of frost, and the resonance in the ground hummed its patient, settled hum, and Tobias Wren went home. O destino desta historia, esta nas suas mas. Se voca acredita que o heroi não esta sozinho, dix su like. Se voca vaio o que os outros não viram, escreva sua teoria nas comentários. E se voca precisa saber o que acontece a seguir, inscreva-se. O próximo capítulo vai mudar tudo.